This episode is sponsored by The Power of You, a leadership resource for entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, and anyone intent on developing their leadership impact and supercharging their career. For more information, check the podcast webpage or show notes. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. I am your host, Blaine Bartlett. I'm excited about today's episode for a number of different reasons. Before we went live here, I was talking with my guest back in quote unquote the green room. Just kind of off camera here. Fascinating. Speaks 9 languages. She consults with and advises the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is Singapore's central bank and financial regulator. But this is just kind of the highlights, just kind of tip of the iceberg. She graduated from MIT with a master's in engineering and electrical engineering. She's worked with some of the most recognizable brands in companies on the planet. She's got a book out that has gotten some pretty good notoriety, and she's got a second book that's coming out, and we're not going to really dive into books so much, but I just want to, she's a published author here, and there's work that she is doing right now that I think is absolutely seminal in terms of transforming the nature of how business is conducted on this planet. She's got a very interesting take on goal setting and some of the, off of the hat here to and James Clear on Atomic Habits. We're not going to be talking about changing habits as much as we are about clarifying why we do some of the things that we do and what can get us in trouble real quickly if we aren't paying attention. And one of those things that can get us into trouble real quickly are some of the standards in business, which have to do with how we actually organize our work process around KPIs and all of these sorts of things that squeeze the life out of people. Quite frankly, this is the soul of business, and souls do not like being put in boxes. And some of our traditional metrics in business put a lot of people in boxes, and they don't have room to create, innovate, and live and breathe and actually be productive in the truest sense of that word. So I'll get off my soapbox here real quick. Radhika Dutt is my guest today. The new book coming out is called Escaping the Performance Trap: Why Goals and Targets Backfire and What Actually Works. Her previous book was Radical Product: Thinking the New Mindset for Innovating Smarter, translated into a number of different languages. Radhika, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Blaine. I'm excited to be here. And I loved your introduction. I think you summed it all up in terms of sucking the soul out of business, right? That's what KPIs and goals and targets do often.
They do. I mean, honestly, on the topic of the soul, and I prefaced, our conversation in the green room around this. The typical question that I will, ask in the show is, when you hear the term the soul of business, what does that bring up for you? And then we just start looking for rabbit holes that we can jump into based on what your answer is. But when you hear the term the soul of business, what does that bring up for you?
Yeah. For me, I actually used to use the word soul sucking when I thought about the kinds of tasks that we spend time on at work, where those sorts of tasks, you would define them as ones that are great for short-term survival, right? And in the long term, they don't match your personal vision. Like, you feel like you're eating at your soul. Yeah. And so you work on that for some time and it keeps eating away and you don't quite realize what happens. But I call that soul debt. And a different quadrant, like the opposite of that, if you're working on something that is good for your personal vision, but that's not sustainable for you, right? And that's body debt. And something that combines both of those is when you find yourself doing double work. And an example of this is, you've been set a certain KPI. You work to show that, look, ta-da, I achieved that KPI. But at the same time, that's not what your business actually needs. So when you truly care about your work, you do double the work to also do what you want what you know needs to be done for the business, right? And so that's both body and soul debt. But all of these, right, put you on the fast track to burnout. And that one quadrant where you so wish you could spend time, which is both good for the vision and good for survival, there's so little that seems to exist of that. And that's what I call soul surplus. So this was something that I had experienced. And one of the reasons that for a long time, goals and KPIs didn't sit right by me, but I couldn't quite articulate it at the time like I could today.
I'm going to love the trajectory of this conversation. I don't think people understand goals well at all. Most people think that the purpose of a goal is to get something. This is KPIs, performance. We're going to get something. We got a 10% revenue increase at the end of this fiscal year. The purpose of a goal is to grow. Now, we get something as a consequence of that, ideally, but the purpose of any goal has to be to grow. And if I'm not setting goals that allow me to grow personally, and this is where the question, for the sake of what am I doing this, comes into play here. And you're talking about, is this good for the business? Is this good for the person? That for the sake of what? That burnout, in my experience, comes as a consequence of losing connection to meaning. Personal meaning. And I do a lot of work in the healthcare systems here in the U.S. I'm on the teaching faculty of the American Association for Physician Leadership, and burnout is, it's a pandemic in healthcare, and it's because these docs are losing connection, and the nurses too are losing connection to what got them into medicine in the first place.
Yeah. And it's often metrics driven, right? Where it's a measurement of how many patients have you seen today. It's a measurement of what is the survival rate in the first year after doing a transplant. And in that case, your incentive is, I don't want to put a patient who is top of the transplant list. I don't want necessarily them to receive this organ because that lowers that number because they're so sick. I'll pick someone else, right? It twists all sorts of incentives, and it sucks the soul out of a lot of these physicians and healthcare professionals.
Yeah. Now you've developed a metric. I'll call it a metric just because I'm not that particularly familiar with it. But I do want to talk about this. You call them OHLs. Can you talk a little bit about that a little? Because I like the distinction you make there, just given the little I understand about it.
Yeah, so let's talk about what happens when you set goals and targets for someone, right? What they want, what incentive you're creating, and what happens as a leader is you're presented numbers saying, ta-da, look, I achieved whatever numbers you wanted. And often it's the bad numbers that get swept under the rug. We can talk about sales even, and even that example that you gave of growth, right? So you set a target for growth, achieve X million revenues by the end of the year. And, revenues will hide a lot of sins because I've seen this in a company that I was working at. I was working at Avid. We were hitting our revenues for one of our products and this whole suite of this whole division of the company. So we were hitting our targets, but the way we were doing that, even though our competitors were encroaching the low end, they were encroaching even the mid-tier, the way we were hitting those numbers was going further and further into the high end, right? And so we were hitting numbers. It made it seem on paper like everything was fine. The reality is we should have been looking at that entire business and saying, you know what? This business is getting commoditized. We need to get out of this and we need to do something else. But this is what, Greg Foran, who used to run Walmart US, was saying. He was saying that, profitability too, it hides a lot of numbers. Walmart's profitability was looking great until you dive deeper and you looked at a lot of these numbers, when you looked at what store managers and their engagements level were at, customers' happiness with stores, blah, blah, like a long list of other metrics that you don't set KPIs for, those weren't looking good, right? So this is the kind of stuff that happens when you set goals and targets. As a leader, you're being shown numbers that everyone wants to show you. So what is the solution instead? If you look at Intel and Andy Grove. Yes, he had goals and OKRs, or OKRs stand for objectives and key results, right? So he did set targets, but that wasn't the main driver in terms of how he ran business. That wasn't the soul of his business, right?
Exactly.
The soul of how he ran, or the soul of his leadership, was that it was this paranoid obsession with never getting complacent. And it meant that he was constantly getting everyone to experiment, to adapt, to challenge his ideas. He didn't have a corner office. He used to have a cubicle along with everyone else so that people could challenge his ideas as equals. Right? He always said, you don't want to shoot the messenger. If there's something wrong on the front lines, I would rather know now. And I want people to feel free to tell me that and challenge my ideas. And so all of this is what we missed out. What we need is a framework for this experimentation and adaptation. And that's what I talk about in this framework that, as you rightly pointed out, is OHLs, or objectives, hypotheses, and learnings. And what this framework means is that you are working on puzzle setting and puzzle solving. And we know that puzzles, they are the soul, right? Instead of soul crushing, that is what adds soul to business. You want to help people see the puzzle that they're solving, and you want to give them scaffolding as they're doing this puzzle solving so that you can course correct. But together, this is what actually helps us solve really difficult problems. And we can dive into what this means in terms of puzzle setting and puzzle solving, but I'll pause there for a moment.
No, I and I'm going to dive in with you because I'm fascinated with this. You mentioned scaffolding, and again, I'll probably put some outtakes here because our conversation in the green room before we went live was very interesting. But the Intel Andy Grove story. Only the paranoid survive, and Andy had the innate wisdom to actually keep people connected to what was really, the important part of the organization, the soul of the organization. But as we were talking here, you made a comment about he didn't necessarily have the scaffolding or the structure to provide a how-to, for people to actually understand how he was doing and why he was doing what he was doing in the way that it was unfolding. It's the unconsciously competent component.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. That's a brilliant way of putting it, the unconsciously competent component of his leadership, right? And one thing he writes in the book was, he says, you need to be experimenting while things are good in your business. You can't expect that things are on a downturn. Then you start to build this experimentation muscle, right? And the example he gives is of the microprocessor business. Like, that was a whole experiment for a decade before Intel switched from being a memory chips business to a microprocessor business. So
Yeah.
if you don't experiment, you never make these shifts in these inflection points. But you're exactly right. This was such an intuitive thing for him. He didn't offer scaffolding for experimentation and adaptation. The way he described it was, you need to be able to step out of old ruts in the business, and that's the only way you're going to gain new insights. And your operating phrase should be, quote unquote, let chaos reign, right? And as a leader, you listen to that. Your operating process should be let chaos reign. And that is downright scary. He just had this intuitive way of operating in chaos while at the same time not making this chaos terribly inefficient. And as he described it, not making it wear on all participants, right?
Yeah.
So as a leader, that's really where our skill is in, but we haven't been given this scaffolding for how do you do this experimentation and bring people with you in that? Like, how do you ask them to experiment along the lines of what you want them to? And how do you course correct along the way? So that's the kind of scaffolding we needed. And that's what I talk about in puzzle setting and puzzle solving.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've got a specific definition for success, that sustainable success in an organizational context, developing the capacity to continuously start over And that capacity development, it's, what do you mean by capacity? What are the elements that kind of come into play with that? Awareness is a piece of it. Courage, to be able to kind of take that step into the unknown. Discernment, which allows you to actually make some assessments that have some factual components to them that you can actually say, let's do this because that doesn't, all of that sort of stuff. And then the practice, just kind of develop some sort of a habitual way of interacting that is intentional, not subliminal. It just, yeah. And so I, just kind of go on. And then the question of who, not how. Who do I need to go to? So break down the silos and work with it from that perspective. With your OHLs, let's just kind of, if you're willing, do a little bit of a deep dive here.
Yeah.
Objectives, hypotheses, and learnings. You've talked about puzzle identification, and then puzzle solving. So
let's dive into that. Let's start with puzzle setting. And I'm going to pick the hardest example to start with, because sales is that one example where we've always learned all our lives that you have to set targets for sales, right? That's the only way you achieve sales. But I gave the example of Avid and how, sales hide sins or revenues hide sins, right? So what do? Here's how you do puzzle setting. And this is the objectives part of OHLs. So in a sales example, what I would do to set a puzzle is I would say, okay, I expect us to get to X million in revenues, but here's what I'm seeing. Sales grew in the last 3 years, and I've seen that in the last year, sales have stalled. So what might be going on? And here I might write down some guiding questions that I honestly don't know the answer to. So guiding questions might be, is it that, our competitors are doing something that that has leapfrogged us that we haven't caught up with? Is it that something has fundamentally shifted in the market? Is it that there's something new going on within our sales team? So these are just some examples, right? Maybe our sales team has been used to selling to the early adopter, but we haven't figured out how to sell into the mass market. So there may be a bunch of such questions that I genuinely don't know answers to. I invite feedback from other people within the organization, and we have just set this problem statement and guiding questions that defines the puzzle. And the objective is the summary of this, right? Which is that we want to grow sales to X million. And how might we do that? By solving this puzzle. So that's the first piece. That's the puzzle setting. And now let's talk about puzzle solving, because often in organizations, where we've been used to saying, ta-da, look, I achieved whatever number you wanted, we've been used to sweeping the bad numbers under the rugs. And so you need to rebuild that skill where you need people to play detective and look at those bad numbers and go, okay, what's really going on, right? And so this is where the puzzle setting aspect involves asking 3 questions. And that's the framework I described, which is question 1 is asking, how well is it working? And by the way, this is similar to what you were saying earlier. And in asking how well is it working, this is notably different from targets, right? Where targets ask the question, have you or haven't you achieved this goal? And that becomes soul-sucking. Whereas asking this question, how well did it work, is now this area where you're playing detective, right? I'm trying to figure out how well did it actually work? It's a curiosity-driven question. And that's where I define the hypothesis as well as leading and lagging indicators. So by the way, this is not frou-frou, forget metrics sort of thing. It is very rigorous. And I'm working on figuring out exactly how it worked and what is even the definition of it worked and what.
Now, that language? Language is. I'm a bit of a linguist, and the way that language creates reality, but it also reflects reality. And I find oftentimes in organizations, particularly when things have gone a bit sideways, there's a lot of conversation about what went right and what went wrong. Mostly what went wrong, and both of those words, right and wrong, have values associated with them, which is different than, is this working or not working, which tends to be values free and lends itself to less defensive posturing. In the exploration. I mean, I love the fact that you're using that phraseology, working, not working. Yeah.
And that's such a brilliant insight. I think what you talk to, that's really about creating that sort of psychological safety
Mm-hmm.
where, you want people to talk about things very honestly as they're seeing it so that we can actually look at good and bad stuff, quote unquote, very objectively and say, what can we tell in terms of how things are working, right? So that was the first question. How well is it working? The second question is, what have we learned? So this is where I say to teams, don't just throw out numbers at me. Don't just tell me here's the weekly number of active users, the time spent on site, or the amount of downtime or uptime, whatever it is. Like, often it's just a list of stats that people would share. And I have to tell them, no, let's stop there. Tell me what you've learned. And this is a harder question to answer, by the
Yeah,
way, because
it
it's not the
is.
shortcut of just tell me numbers and make me do the work. It's more like, you figure this out and describe to me the narrative and that storytelling of what have you figured out from the numbers. You have to play detective. And then comes, by the way, the third question, which is based on how well it's working and what have you learned, what will you try next?
Mm-hmm.
And that question is sort of that light bulb moment where, I'm asking you basically, if I gave you a magic wand and looking at how well it worked and what you learned, what is that one thing you would ask for? So it's not that it's cost free, but
Right.
like based on your deep thinking, what are we going to do? And so this is the puzzle setting format, puzzle solving format, asking the three questions. And it triggers both the left brain because you're looking at analytics, and
Mm-hmm.
also triggers the right brain as you do the storytelling, and saying, what will you ask for if you have this magic wand? Right? I'll pause there. I'd love your thoughts.
Well, what I'm liking about this is there's an old, you may be familiar with this. I mean, this goes back decades, but there's an old Harvard Business Review article that was called "Who's Got the Monkey?"
Hmm.
And the very short form narration on it is, the employee would come to the boss and say, "I've got a problem," which represents the monkey, and the intent is to pass the monkey off to the boss, and so the boss ends up with monkeys all over the place. What you're doing with these questions, and questions serve two purposes. One is to gather information, but it also points direction. The kind of question you ask points people in a direction to go searching for an answer. And that last question, what are you going to do with what you've learned? How are you going to leverage this? What's that next step you're going to take? Puts the monkey back where it belongs. And
I love this point, right? And what you describe, that article has been misinterpreted by so many people. I think what you share here is the right interpretation, and I love it. A lot of people took it to say, well, don't just come to me with problems, come to me with solutions.
yeah,
And one case study of why this goes wrong was at NASA, for example, where, when they said, when this was the attitude, right? People then are afraid to come to you with the problem because they don't have a solution to this. What
right.
happens if I don't have a solution, right? And so in asking the question in this puzzle solving format, how well did it work? What did you learn? And what are you going to do next? You're not necessarily saying, come to me only when you have a solution, because as part of this, how well did it work and what have we learned? It might also be that, I really need help in figuring out what are we going to do next. Here are some thoughts I have, but I'm inviting feedback.
Yeah. I mean, the definition that I've developed with leadership, what is leadership? How does it get defined? Every consultant worth their salt has got their own definition, and I've got one. Leadership is about influencing, which takes command and control out of the conversation, influencing others in order to co-create. We are in this together, co-create coordinated movement as we move into the unknown. And I love this notion of chaos. As we move into the unknown, we are going to step on each other's toes. We can't not. So how do we actually do the dance when we get there? So influencing in order to co-create coordinated movement in pursuit of a worthy ideal, not a KPI, but a worthy ideal,
Mm-hmm.
something that's inspirational, not motivational. And what you're doing with your framework here, and I love how it's been simplified, at least in my mind as I'm thinking about it. as a puzzle. Just it's a puzzle to be identified and then solved. But I'm not doing it by myself, and I'm not asking you to do it by yourself. Let's just kind of sit around the table with all these jigsaw pieces and see how the puzzle comes together. We don't have the box cover with the picture on it, so now we got to kind of sort it out ourselves, sort of a
Yeah.
thing.
And I love what you said earlier as well. This is something where you talked about how do you introduce this and then make this become a mindset and a way of thinking, how it becomes normalized as a way of working, right?
Yeah.
And that I found to be a really important piece of the whole puzzle setting and puzzle solving, just making this become a mindset. Because one thing you don't want to do is just add more process burden for people.
Yeah.
Because the moment you say that this is another step in what you have to do, people go like, oh no, we don't have time for that, right? And so there was this organization that I started working with. It's called Signal. It's in the maritime industry. I've been working with them for a couple of years. And when I started, they were very goal and target centric. We were measuring progress in terms of, have we hit this goal in terms of the number of weekly active users or not, etc. And we had to start doing this puzzle setting and puzzle solving because when I tried to approach the CEO saying, let's stop using targets, that didn't fly very well, by the way.
I can imagine.
And I empathize with leaders. I learned from that because I realized, for leaders, it's a scary prospect. OKRs, it's the devil I know, right? And here I am suggesting, let that go. But yeah, what's the alternative? And so what I had to do was I introduced this to the team just as not a replacement. Let's just try this out as a way of framing the problem for ourselves. Let's just talk about how things are going with the product. And we started using this, and it completely changed within a span of just 2 months. It completely changed the mindset of people. Because once I introduced this, it took like a couple of tries for people to get this right. Because the first time around, I was seeing in that second column of what have we learned, I saw a bunch of stats. So I had to go back and like, nope. This is not what I want. Tell me the story. And a couple of times later, they got it right. And from then on, they started thinking in this way. I no longer had to sort of course correct, but rather every time there were discussions, they were talking about the experiment and, here's what we learned and here's what we can try next. And we started using this everywhere. It wasn't just, in our product. We started presenting information from our design sprints in this way. We ran a design sprint. We talked to customers every day. We had learnings and we started presenting in terms of how well did it work? What did we learn? What are we going to do next? And in the span of a week, you could see how steep our learning curve was and how far up we got up that curve. It was fantastic. So my point is, even the CEO realized what a difference this made. And his observation was the following. OKRs give you the view in the rear view mirror where, in retrospect, did you or didn't you hit it? But OHLs, they're like the ears on the ground where you actually make measurement actionable because you anticipate what's coming.
Mm-hmm. I love that metaphor. I'll just kind of extend it a little bit. I want to feel the road. Just imagine driving a car here.
Yeah.
I want a suspension that's tuned so that I can feel the road, and if I'm tuned into that, I have seen too many times where I've worked with clients, as you have too, where they're driving their vehicle, their business, looking in the rearview mirror as they're doing it, and they get blindsided. They're not feeling that they're starting to sway just a little bit here. Yeah, Napoleon Hill calls this drifting. Yeah. And when we start to drift, we're not thinking, we're not paying attention, we're not actually organized in a way that allows us to course correct in real time. And the summary on this, and I'm not saying summary in the sense that we're concluding here, although we're getting close, but the idea, you're training people essentially, and I'll say training here, but there's an educational component around critical thinking that you're introducing here that I think an over-reliance on traditional metrics has actually numbed us to. We don't critically think about what's going on, which is why I love the learning piece of in your OHLs. They have that learning. What are we learning?
Your extension of that analogy is so insightful because, as a leader, when you're making decisions, when you don't have a feel for the ground, when you don't have that car going over the speed bump and it gives you that feedback, right? You make sometimes decisions without having that information from the front line. And so what this is giving you visibility to is that sort of information. That's the feel on the ground, so that if you're taking the curve, for instance, at what speed you can take the curve, or if you have to slow down. And you kind of miss that when your bumpers are sort of so soft, or what do you call it? Sorry, the shock absorbers are so soft that you don't feel anything at all, right?
You get this weird sway and it's kind of like, where's that coming from? I can't feel it. I can't sense it. I can't sense it. Yeah, that's beautiful. Radhika, where can people find out more about what you're up to? I mean, I want to send as many people as we can in your direction. And this is something that I think needs to get out there in a very dramatic way.
Yeah, so I'm sharing a sneak preview to the next book that I'm working on. Mm-hmm. The book is going to come out in about a year, towards the end of 2026. But in the meanwhile, people can reach out to me on LinkedIn, and they can also download the free template for OHLs. You can go to rdutt.com, or you can find radicalproduct.com, and the toolkit is there. And by the way, you can also read the Radical Product Thinking book, which was the first book that came out.
Yeah.
But one thing about a sneak preview is that you get to contribute content if you like. So,
hey,
if you
sign me up.
So, as you use OHLs along the way and use this framework, I would love to hear people's experiences, because I have case studies in the book. But, I love hearing people's experiences. So feel free to share with me on LinkedIn how you use OHLs, and I might write up your case study too.
I'd love that. Okay, folks, you've got the invitation there. It's been offered. Take advantage of it. Radhika Dutt, thank you so much. I have loved this conversation. I could continue it way beyond what I'm supposed to.
Likewise, I love this conversation. It was so insightful.
Well, when the book is ready to come out, let's see if we can get you back on the show. I've got a couple of other shows that I think would be very advantageous just in terms of exposure that I can get you onto as well. Yeah, an office hours thing that we do on Apple TV and a couple of other things.
Oh, brilliant. I'd love that.
We'll make it happen. Folks, this is Blaine Bartlett. You've been listening to The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. Radhika Dutt has been my guest today. It's been a wonderful conversation. As we sign off here, I want to just kind of revisit what I always say at the end. Use nature as your teacher. I mean, if you look around in nature, I grew up on a farm. Everybody knows this by now, but everything in nature serves a purpose, and one of the purposes that everything in nature serves is to be a center of distribution in some way, shape, or form. There is nothing in nature that serves solely as a center of accumulation. Be part of nature. You are, so act like it. Be a center of distribution in your life. Give something away, whether it's a hug, whether it's a smile, whether it's an insight, an idea. It doesn't have to be money, but be a center of distribution. The world works in that way. Nature works in that way. Until next episode, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time. This episode is sponsored by The Power of You, a leadership resource for entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, and anyone intent on developing their leadership impact and supercharging their career. For more information, check the podcast webpage or show notes. Hi, I'd like to ask you to do something for me if you wouldn't mind. If you like this episode, I'd like you to not only subscribe on your favorite site, but I'd also like you to give a rating. Ideally, a 5-star rating would be greatly appreciated. But I think more importantly also would be just some comments. That helps with the algorithm, and it helps build the audience with this. And more than anything else, if you could invite somebody else to listen, just share this episode with a friend, with a colleague. And I'd like to see how we can grow the soul of business. I think it makes a difference. Thanks.